For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Jay Crockett. Political analyst Aubrey Mashiki joins me to discuss South Africa's next political decade. You begin your column by stating that the people have spoken regarding the May 2014 elections. What, in your opinion, did the votes reveal about what the electorate was saying?
Well, to understand what the electorate was saying, you need to do multiple readings. Because what tends to happen is that people take one aspect of the election outcome and try to pretend it is definitive. Whereas if you do multiple readings, you will, for instance, do a national reading, compare it to, let's say, a provincial reading, particularly a reading of what voters in Gauteng are saying. Now, what I've tried to do is to look at the most interesting aspects. And to that end, I've looked at the national reading compared to the Gauteng reading. And the reason I focus so much on Gauteng is because I think this is the one province where the incidence of vote splitting and tactical voting was the highest. Because if you look at the disjuncture between the 62.15% that was achieved by the ANC at a national level and the 53.5% that was achieved by the ANC in Gauteng, the disjuncture suggests quite a high level of tactical voting or vote splitting by ANC supporters. And it seems to me what ANC voters are saying is that they are unhappy about aspects of the delivery record of the ANC, about the gap between the ideals of the ANC and what it has become, and have sent that message quite strongly in Gauteng, but are not quite ready yet to abandon the ANC. And that message they have sent by continuing to support the ANC at national level, despite the fact that they've abandoned it at provincial level.
You state that voters want the same thing, but do not want the same thing for everyone. What do you mean by this?
Well, all South Africans, whether they voted or not, want the same thing. They want to know they matter, they want a sense of significance, and they want a better life for themselves, their children, their families, and their communities. But given our history, and given our social class and race relations, sometimes I get the sense that to the extent that people in South Africa want a better life for themselves, they do not want the same for those who do not look like them or are not like them socially, racially, or in class terms. So that makes it very difficult for South Africa to unite behind a common vision for its future. Because what tends to happen, especially at the level of the social partners, be it civil society, be it the state, be it labor, or the private sector, is that people try to maximize narrow interests at the expense of the greater good.
You believe that there was a failure on our part to realize that the first task after a bruising election is for all of us to heal the wounds caused by divisive electioneering. Why is this necessary, and how do we do this?
As a nation, we have certain bad habits, which are a function of our history. We are sometimes too quick to fall back on race when we are faced with a national challenge around which we should have a strategic conversation. I'm in a state of despair with regard to how quickly it took us to fall back into the old patterns of bad behavior after the election. The election was held just a month ago. But what did we see immediately after the election? We have seen a poisoned discourse in response, for instance, to the EWN cartoon, which characterizes ANC voters as pooples and clowns. Then you have a DA leader putting together a picture depicting ANC voters as dogs. And then last week, we had the South African Institute of Race Relations saying affirmative action kills babies, when in fact, the Institute could easily have shown that affirmative action practiced in particular ways can have negative outcomes without being so insensitive and melodramatic or unwise, as far as I'm concerned. And what seems to be happening here is that for reasons maybe we are still to understand, we get easily sucked into this vortex of a racialized and poisoned discourse. And it blinds us from looking at other things, such as looking at the need to have strategic conversation about youth development, about the state of our economy, and about how we should unite behind a common vision to cure that which ails South Africa today.
In order to create a stable, open and honest South Africa, unity is essential. What other ingredients are vital in order to achieve this?
I think we must start by remembering that people of my generation and those who are older have borrowed the future from the youth. Now, if you look at youth unemployment and you look at youth underdevelopment, and these patterns continue, if the pattern continues that so many of our young people are excluded from the social and economic mainstream, and our young people lack opportunities, it is going to be very difficult for South Africa to have a bright future. So one of the challenges of the next decade, as far as I'm concerned, must be about youth development. But you're not going to achieve youth development unless you merge the wisdom, the age and experience of our generation and older generations with the energy and innovation and creativity of young people. Because together, these are the ingredients we need to drive South Africa forward. So youth development is quite essential. And we're blessed with a very young population. The median age in South Africa is 25. Among so-called black Africans, it is 21. And therefore there are two things as a South African nation we must do. We must educate these young people very well, and we must look after their health very well. The second thing we must look at, and for many people this is not sexy, but I believe it is strategic, is the issue of environmental justice and environmental factors as a component of economic planning. Now, if current studies on things such as climate change are anything to go by, it is essential that we incorporate environmental factors into economic planning. And the floods we had in March in a province such as Gauteng suggest that we may not be able to afford the cost of environmental factors if we don't incorporate them sufficiently into economic planning. And this for me is not just a national challenge, but a global challenge. The third one is the economy. Unless you have an economy that is inclusive, what you're going to get is conflict coming out of the exclusion of those who lack opportunity. Now, of course, for those of us who are middle class, the exclusion of those who lack opportunities is not sustainable even for our own interests, because a society in conflict might have negative impacts even on our own economic well-being. And therefore, the economic well-being of the middle class is dependent on the well-being of those who are poor and those who are working class.
You state that South Africa is currently experiencing a leadership crisis. Is it correct to assume that there is also a crisis of a dearth of leaders? Why do you say this?
We don't have a crisis of lack of leaders. we have a crisis of leadership. There are many good leaders in South Africa across the board. There are many good leaders in business, in labor, in politics, and other spheres of South African life. What we lack are leaders who lead in a transcendent manner, leaders who are willing and are able to transcend the limitations of their own sectors and their narrow interests. For me, that's what accounts for the lack of leadership, that too many of our leaders are either unable or unwilling to transcend the limitations of their narrow interests and their sectors.
What is the way forward for South Africa?
Well, the way forward, first of all, is honest engagement. We need to be honest about the things we don't agree on and be very honest about why we don't agree. In other words, we cannot have successful strategic conversations about the economy, about politics, about the social sphere, unless we're honest one with the other. Because in the absence of honesty, amongst other things, what you're going to get is code switching. In other words, people are not going to say things in the presence of others that they say in their absence, which means in whatever strategic conversation we're trying to have, we'll always have a partial picture of what is really happening in South Africa. And we're going to plan our future on the basis of a partial picture, and therefore are not going to be fully successful in our endeavors. And therefore, honesty on top of the trust that I spoke about is essential if South Africa is going to change direction. Secondly, at a political level, we need greater levels of accountability on the part of our politicians, especially those who are in government. Secondly, you need a much more competitive political system. And if you look at the outcomes of the May elections, they suggest to me that our political system is becoming less uncompetitive. Some might say it is becoming more competitive. I prefer to say it's becoming less uncompetitive. The fact that in a province like Gauteng, people voted as tactically as they did suggests that people are no longer limiting their choices to a single party, but are looking for alternative to give effect to their aspirations. But that's never going to be enough. You need to change the political system more fundamentally, also by changing the electoral system. You need an electoral system that foregrounds the interests of the citizen over the interests of the party or the party boss, because the current electoral system privileges the needs and interests of party bosses over the needs and interests of the ordinary citizen. So you need a system that takes the best from the proportional representation system and from the so-called constituency-based system. So I am convinced that you need a mixed system to give effect to the aspirations of the ordinary citizen. That too will never be enough. A different political culture must take root, because electoral system reform on its own is not going to produce a culture of accountability. So fundamentally what you need is a change in our political culture. And something which always comes as an afterthought for too many of us is the fact that as long as there are citizens or groups of citizens who are discriminated against on the basis of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, country of origin, as a society we will never be able to achieve our full potential, especially when it comes to gender. As long as women are discriminated against, the South African society will never achieve its full potential. So instead of creating a women's ministry and therefore creating a ghetto that deals with the women's issues, what we needed much more of is the mainstreaming of gender issues and women's issues in that regard. because I cannot overemphasize the fact that we will always perform below our potential if we don't mainstream gender issues to make sure that all issues of national strategic importance are women's issues too.
There was political analyst Aubrey Mashiki speaking about South African politics.